Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. It's Friday, August 15th, 2025, episode 465, Fixing the System. This is sort of, I don't know, inspired by just things that I've been seeing around, maybe a little bit frustration and venting. But I do want to say that I actually recorded this episode on Wednesday, and that's because we're going down to see Ron Paul at the Ron Paul conference this Saturday down in just outside Washington, D.C. And if you're there by any chance, look for four Asian dudes. Me and three of my sons will be there hanging out. But anyway, I'm hoping it'll be a really great time. I'll do a episode talking about it after next week, right? But anyways, let's get back to fixing the system. Basically, fixing the system to me means undermining and ultimately destroying the system because you can't fix the system. It's just so broken. It's so damaged and so corrupt. I mean, Trump was going to drain the swamp twice. And I said this a lot last year, but he was basically almost assassinated. He almost died because he said he would drain the swamp. So I thought that, well, okay, all bets are off. He's just going to go to town and clean up that place. And it looked like that's what he was going to do, but I think he got, right? So someone got to him, and so he had to reverse course. And if he is doing some kind of 4D chess, then it's either accidental or he's doing it in such a subtle way that a lot of people can't see it. Dave Smith, Dave Smith had talked about a story. He went to Ron Paul's birthday bash, which I wish I could go, but unfortunately, my schedule would not allow me to do so. But he talked about how he saw Tulsi Gabbard there and how when their eyes met, she went directly up to him and hugged him. And he had a reading on it. Like he interpreted it in a certain way. He said it was really awkward, because he's been trashing Tulsi Gabbard for things that she's been doing, obviously, going against what she said that she would do, but also looking like she is lying, basically. And so he had some not so kind things to say, and he said it was really awkward. I read it differently. Okay. And maybe it's just me. Maybe it's just the pastor in me where I always try to read things in a positive way. But I read because she didn't say anything, right? But it was a very, very heartfelt hug. At least that's what Dave Smith said. I didn't see it, obviously, but I read it different. I read it that she knows what he said about her. She knows, and it pains her, right? Because she didn't smile, right? So it wasn't like, oh, I'm glad to see you. Thanks for saying all that stuff about me. It wasn't that at all, but it was very somber. It was very serious, as if to say, there are so many things that I want to say. I cannot, and I cannot tell you why either. Right. So it seemed to me that kind of hug, because I've done hugs like that, and you can't say anything, right? You're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. So you say nothing, but you hope that the hug itself would convey, look, I know what's going on, and you know, I appreciate everything that you've said. And that's kind of the way that I read it. I could be wrong, only time will tell, but I think that kind of tells you just how much people are threatened once they get into DC, that no matter all your ideals, all your values, now you have to make a calculation. Does the life of my family, is it worth more to me than spilling all the beans, right? Or am I willing to sacrifice my family? Because I think the only way you can get to a person like Trump or Tulsi Gabbard is if their families are on the line, right? Someone says, we'll murder your entire family, your extended family, and all their friends if you do anything that you said you would do, right? And most people they back down, right? They're not ready for that. They can't live with themselves if their whole family is exterminated because they needed to get something out, right? And that's the way I read it. I'm probably wrong, but whatever. It doesn't harm, it doesn't hurt me for saying it, but that's the way I read the way I read it. And I was kind of surprised that Dave Smith took it so negatively, but anyway. I mean, you can't bribe someone with a hug, right? You can't sway someone with a hug. So the hug has to be a communication, right? It has to be a message of some kind. But anyway, that's just me. Moving on. There was a guy I listened to, oh, I don't know, going on 10 years ago, maybe. Uh, and his name was Max Borders. I don't know if that's his real name, but that's basically the name that he goes by. Max Borders, and he gave this seminar on innovation. Like it was a talk on innovation. I don't remember it exactly, but I know that he used to run this conference called Voice and Exit, and it was all about innovation to get out of the system. Right. And now I think he's involved in this thing called Social Borders. I didn't have time to look it up um, because, I'm down in DC. But anyway, so but basically the message was innovation is the way to undermine the system, to get out of the system, because the only really way to fix the system is to get out of the system, to be independent from the state, right? So you find ways to unplug, and not all of us can do it whole hog, right? Because we have families and we have lives, right? And so you can do it as much as you can in wherever you place that you can, right? And so I've always had a warm spot in my heart for smugglers, for black markets, and anyone else who would rebel against the system somehow. Airbnb, Uber, Lyft, FedEx. I mean, any of these things which were innovations in their time, and which basically undermine the status quo, the system as it existed in that particular area. Ron Paul was asked once about tax exempt, right? Oh, what do you think about the tax exempt status of this or that? And he's like, well, everyone should be tax exempt, and I love these answers that he comes up with. It would have been, it's pretty awesome. But anyway, taxes feed the beast. Right. And this is why the government is pushing CBDC through cryptos, CBDCs through other savings vehicles, quote unquote savings vehicles, right? Because the beast is hungry and the beast needs to be fed. And CBDCs makes it a lot easier for everything to be tracked, right? And so my conversation is on the micro level, right? In our own personal individual way, right? We have to figure out ways to unplug from the system, right? Because the problem is like if it's on a big scale, once the state gets wind of it, it's shut down and it's impossible to repeat it, right? They only let it happen once. And that's the signal to everybody. Oh, it's working. So now you got to shut it down. So seasteading, I talked about it a couple of years ago, I believe, and how it was on the verge of being successful and then it was shut down. Right. And that's where I've stopped following the story, but it was over by French Polynesia. That's where they were going to have this floating state-free zone, but then it was shut down. By whom? At the time, no one knew. Then Ron Paul's presidential run in 2012. I mean, uh, without the shenanigans that happened in the Republican convention, then it would have been what do you call that? A convention that did not have a clear candidate, a brokered convention. That's what it was. And so then they would have to have, other votes, and no one wanted that. And so they basically disallowed all of the delegates who voted for Ron Paul. They wouldn't even report his name as receiving any votes. And so that was criminal, in my opinion. And so I would tell my students in when I was when I was teaching back in the university that I told them that yes, I was teaching them how to be subversive, right? So I didn't say it before, but after a while, students would ask me, "So are you basically teaching us to basically be subversive, to be radicals?" And I'm like, yeah, yeah. The difference, however, from many other professors was that I want you to do it legally. In other words, do it in such a way that you are not in jail, right? So, and I'm not talking about having political protection like BLM and Antifa, where they have political connections to keep them out of jail, no matter what crime they commit. I'm talking about doing something that is so awesome, right? It's legal. It undermines the status quo, and so therefore you can't go to jail for it, right? One example, radical example I would give is 3D printing of guns, right? Of lower receivers and 80%, completing 80% lowers and things like that. And the way the 3D printing of guns happened was because of freedom of speech, right? Because they're printing guns. I thought that was just so incredible the way that the manipulation of language that way. But that is one way of being subversive. That's one way to undermine the system, to reduce the power and control that it has over you, right? Exiting the country to a place that would welcome your ideas, right? And I've talked about, I don't know if I talked about it on the podcast, but medical tourism is becoming bigger because the medicine in the United States is becoming so stifling that certain groundbreaking treatments are only available in other countries like Mexico. Like I remember there was a story about a woman who had to go to Mexico to see a doctor to basically cure her baby who hadn't been born yet. So it was basically a gestational operation. And the doctor who was willing to do that was from America, but he wasn't allowed to do it in the United States. And so he had to go to another country to be able to perform that operation, right? So exiting the country to a place that would welcome your ideas, that will give you the freedom to be able to pursue something because there is no existing special interest group that would try to block it, right? And so the existing medical establishment here in America wants to regulate medicine so strictly to restrict competition so as to not be a threat to old style medicine, to older doctors, to old ways of doing research and getting funded for research. Okay. Now, the how you do now, I'm not going to do a whole list. I've done this a couple of times over the last 2 years, but I'm not going to give you a list of how things people did it, but how do you come up with a way to exit, right? How do you become independent of the state, right? Um, well, the way that you do it, you start with your own problem, your personal problem. And I've talked about this before, but other professors, like when we would have this innovation contest, right, in collaboration with the business school at my former university, all of the other professors, because they were socialists, right, they gave the students prepackaged problems. They said, "Here's a problem, food insecurity. Now solve it," right? Which is funny because I laugh not at food insecurity itself, but to say solve food insecurity means you got to go into cause, like where does the food insecurity come from, right? So without addressing that, then all you're going to do is come up with the same problem, same solutions over and over again. You're not really going to have a real solution. So other professors, they would start with a specific problem. And I said, and those were the problems they cared about. And most students had to learn to care about them, right? And so I would say, look, forget about all that. Like you got problems, I got problems. So start with your personal problem. And so every student had a different starting point, just like every student has a different starting point learning about liberty, right? And how it applies to them and how it will change their life, right? And so this is what made it so that every student could relate to what I was teaching uniquely from their own perspective. Like in other words, I didn't have to make them all become Korean evangelicals, right? That wasn't the goal, but was to show them how to solve their own problems, the problems that meant the most to them, not my problems, not someone else's problems, not the problems of the state, their own, right? And so then and yeah, after I showed them how most of the problems that these other professors are telling them to solve are the creation of the government, right? Well, then, okay, you don't have to worry about that, right? Government is the cause, right? So just get rid of government. And so while we're trying to undermine the government, let's figure out our own problems, how to solve our own problems. And by doing that, by solving our own problems, see, right, we're coming out of the system. We're not dependent on the system, on the government, if you will. And we have to share those ideas because other people are going to have those same problems and they're hungry for solutions. And it might not be that the same solution works for them, but to see other people working on similar problems sparks that creativity to say, well, I can't do that, so I'll do it this way. And they can sort of rework your solution that you came up with in a way that works for them, right? So modify it, you know, tweak it, if you will, right? Which is why I'm not really a big fan of intellectual property, right? Because once you claim ownership to an idea, which is impossible, you can't do that anyway. But once you do that, then you can't innovate using that idea. You can't grow it more. You can't spin it. You can't tweak it. You can't modify it in some way. And so there shouldn't be any kind of intellectual property. We talked about the Wright brothers and Curtis, before. But once you patent something, you make it illegal to work on that idea, to improve it, to make life better. Sometimes you'll make money from your idea, maybe you won't. But overall, life gets better. Like if everyone knew how to solve their problem this way, everyone's life gets better. And so society gets better. It's happier. It's less angry. You don't have as many protests, right? You don't care about war as much. Okay. And so this is what the goal was. And it was pretty exciting. The students got into it and they came up with some crazy ideas. And I have an episode really when it was double digit episode numbers. I shared some of the things that students came up with. It was pretty cool. It was like the best time, man. But also all the other professors, they hated it because the ideas were so crazy. But they were all original, and that's what pleased me the most. But anyway, in order for us to be able to do this, we need peace, we need stability. As long as we are under the control of the state, we're not going to have peace. We're not going to have stability. The Ron Paul always said this line, and it's from George Orwell. But truth is treason in an empire of lies, and that's what we're living under, right? Propaganda, government messaging. How all those people someone says, okay, we're going to call Republicans weird now, and they're all calling everyone weird, right? And it's this weird, strange phenomena of mindlessness that you're seeing. And I think it's left and right, right? Less so on the right, but it's there, right? And I talked about Christian nationalism, right? Which is really, really bad. But it's just basically lefties of a different color, okay? And because they have certain characteristics they're thrown in with the Republicans, right? But they're really the same. The left and the right extremists, they're all the same, different colors, that's all, different varieties of the same phenomena. So you have to be independent of the state, right? Because the state is going to just come at you because what you're trying to do is treasonous. You're undermining what the state is trying to do. So you got to try to be independent of the state. Don't rely on Social Security. Like you have to pay Social Security tax. You can't avoid that. You have to have a Social Security number. Can't avoid that, unless, at least to my knowledge. Maybe you figured out a way, but can't have that. So, but don't rely on, don't make your retirement rely on Social Security. It's just not going to be there, right? Don't take out loans to go to college or, for other things, government loans, to stay away from them. I personally stay away from IRAs and other vehicles such as that, primarily because it's tied to the stock market, right? And stock market is cooked, it's I don't know, it's not real. So anyway, alternatives can be found in voluntary cooperation. So we have to show people how cooperation is better, right? The way we live our lives. We have to show people how doing things with a smile, being happy is better than being miserable and complaining about everything. Sometimes it's a character flaw, to complain all the time, but hey, I think it can be changed, right? Because I used to be negative all the time and now I'm generally positive, right? Except when I'm talking about the state that yeah, and usually when there is a need, that's opportunity, right? When someone else needs something, well, that's a chance for you to educate this person, to teach this person as you're helping them. In other words, desperation is a window. A window, if we're desperate, it's a window to learn, right? Okay, whatever I've been doing, it's not working. I am open to suggestions. And you're so desperate that you're willing to do the work to get you where you need to be, right? And so obviously, this only works with people who you know, so you can communicate, say what words, avoid certain words that will trigger them, but also say it in a way that they'll understand, right? But let's not wait till we're desperate or for other people are desperate. And so we try to live every day of our lives by example, like we're doing it under the principles of freedom and voluntary cooperation, uh, trying to not be dependent on the state. And this is what I'm doing, right? And so when people ask, and people will ask, you'll have an answer, right? I don't know what your circle of friends are, but the way that I do it is when I'm talking with someone and they're complaining about something, and the tendency is then to blame rich people. I would say, no, here's the root cause, right? And so it's not about right or wrong. It's not about morality, what's moral and what's immoral. It's not that kind of conversation. It becomes a conversation, at least when I do it, it's a conversation of where can we find solutions, right? And now to go down this path, right? Just be aware to be able to successfully go down this path, you have to let go of your emotions. You have to let go of the desire for retribution, revenge, that is. And that's really tough, right? You have to really want to find a solution because, some people, they don't want it solved because that's what gives their life meaning and fun. They get to complain all the time, right? I mean, it's good to complain. Most people hate to be around people who complain all the time, but if you're getting paid for it, oh, way. In fact, if you're allowed to vent on all that negative emotion, then heck yeah, this I can do this my whole life. Right. But no, we really need to want to find a solution. And so we can't be those people who really get off on complaining and destroying things. Okay. And you have to have it, to have a sense of purpose in life. And some people you can't help. And once you make the decision, well, I really can't help this person, you move on to the next person, right? Someone out there is waiting for you to have a conversation with them to show them how to make sense of this crazy world. And hopefully down in DC, as I'm listening at the Ron Paul conference, listening to all those famous figures, that I'll pick up some inspiration as well. So that's it for this episode, and I'll talk to you next time. Take care.